Well, hello. Welcome everybody. This is the first of several asynchronous lectures that will stand in for class that would have taken place yesterday on October 5th. So we left off with a discussion of private funds. We haven't really gotten very far. We introduced them briefly in class, and then we had to stop. So I'm going to pick up today with the discussion of private funds that starts in section 9.2 of the chapter. Okay, so, and as I mentioned in class, this will be a series of relatively short asynchronous lectures of 8 to 10 minutes each. So, private funds, great topic, lots to say. We could spend an entire class on private funds. We just don't have that much time. The term private funds, as we've, I think, already mentioned, generally refers to hedge funds, private equity funds, and venture capital funds. But the term private funds is a precise term legally and refers more specifically to several exclusions from the definition of the term investment company that we will be discussing in coming days and weeks. So we'll get there, but you should know that the lawyers and the industry use this term private fund to generally refer to funds that are not required to be registered under the Investment Company Act of 1940 because they are not offered to the general public. They are private. They're offered to a series of private investors. So as you see, the authors contrast the term private fund with the term investment company, which by definition is a public fund, right, offered to members of the public. The exclusions from the definition of investment company make these excluded funds non-investment companies, right, because they are not considered investment companies or private funds, right? So just to be clear, the authors set up the contrast, and that's exactly right. That makes perfect sense, right? So you've got registered investment companies on the one hand, which are registered and offered to members of the public, and private funds on the other, which are not registered with the SEC and offered only to private individuals or institutions. Okay, so the authors first talk about hedge funds, then private equity funds, and then venture cap. So let's start with hedge funds. The hedge fund industry, the authors tell us, was born really in the 1950s. It grew very steadily, and now it's just enormous, right? It's a very, very large sector of the economy. Hedge funds, in some ways, are a lot like mutual funds. They are actively managed funds, just like many mutual funds are actively managed. However, they do not have the governance requirements that we will discuss that apply to public funds, like a board of directors and a certain number of independent directors, right? They just don't have those requirements because they're not subject to the Investment Company Act the way public funds are subject to the Investment Company Act. To understand the structure of a private fund, or the general structure, we can look briefly at the figure on page 185. It's figure 9A. That gives us the general structure of a private fund. Note that most hedge funds are organized as limited partnerships and some as LLCs, limited liability companies. If a hedge fund is organized as a limited partnership, that means that that business entity will have to have at least one general partner and at least one limited partner. As some of you may recall, the general partner has unlimited liability for the entire entity. The limited partners have limited liability, much like shareholders of a corporation have limited liability. So if the hedge fund is structured as a limited partnership, generally speaking, the general partner of the limited partnership is the investment advisor to the fund, and the limited partners are the investors in that fund, right? So when you think about it, that makes perfect sense. The general partner is the investment advisor. That's the entity that's calling the shots, making the decisions, and will have unlimited liability if something goes wrong. The limited partners, which don't have the ability to call the shots, are mere investors in the entity. That's why they're called limited partners. They're sort of like passive owners. They make those investments, they hope to gain, but they're not managing the fund, they're not calling the shots. And so if you think about it, the limited partnership structure works very well. The limited partnership itself is the entity, that's the fund, that's where the assets are located. The general partner to that limited partnership is the investment advisor, and the limited partners to the limited partnership are the investors in the fund. We can discuss this more in class when we meet, but hopefully, especially for those of you who have had business organizations, that structure will make a lot of sense. So that helps us, I think, when we take a look at the figure 9a on page 185. The authors talk about a few other things. They mention compensation, which we discussed last time in class. That's the so-called 2 and 20, 2% of assets under management and a 20% performance fee. We already discussed that. The authors discuss limited redemption. As you know, if a fund is a public fund, an investment company, investors can redeem any day of the week, right? Any business day of the week, they can sell their shares and they get that day's closing price. Typically, hedge funds have very limited redemption rights. They do not allow their private investors to redeem any day of the week. Typically, they might allow them to redeem once a month, maybe once a quarter, sometimes less often. So there are limited redemption rights. And then finally, the authors discuss the old exemption from registration, which I mentioned quickly at the end of last class. So it used to be the case that if an investment advisor had fewer than 15 clients, that advisor was exempt from registration. And so that was the way for many years that investment advisors to the hedge funds, right, the advisors to the funds, they were able to escape registration under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 because they said, look, we manage only 3, 4, 5, 6 hedge funds. That's fewer than 15, and so we qualify for the fewer than 15 exemption, even though it's a very large investment advisor with many, many millions, perhaps billions of dollars of assets under management, but they still met the terms of the exemption. Just a little bit of history. The SEC wanted to change that rule. It wanted investment advisors to hedge funds to be registered, and so it passed a rule in 2004 to require the hedge fund advisors, when counting the number of clients they had, to essentially look through the fund and not to count the fund as the client, but rather to count the individual investors in the fund as clients. Of course, if you do that, right, then you have many more clients than 15 because there are many investors, underlying investors in the funds, and the advisors would have to register. So the SEC passed that rule. It was the look-through rule in 2004. The industry didn't like that rule. There were many hedge fund advisors that did not want to register. It only took one hedge fund advisor to challenge the rule in court. That's what happened. That was the Goldstein case decided in 2006, which the authors mentioned. The hedge fund that challenged the rule was Opportunity Partners. And indeed, the courts agreed with the hedge fund and essentially vacated the SEC's rule so that until the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, that rule was thrown out and the SEC was not able to require hedge fund advisors to register. As I mentioned in class, that all changed in the Dodd-Frank Act. The rules changed pretty dramatically. The SEC did not have to pass another rule because Congress effectively stepped in and required hedge fund advisors to register back in 2010. But it is interesting to know a little bit of the history of what happened before 2010 and how it is that the SEC tried to have hedge fund advisors register through that rule, which ultimately failed in the courts. But as I say, at the end of the day, the SEC may have lost the battle, but it won the war because in the Dodd-Frank Act, hedge fund advisors, for the most part, are required to register. So that brings us to the end of our first asynchronous lecture, and I'll see you when we pick up with the second segment.